Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. And welcome to today's virtual event, Solutions for Circularity in Canada's Built Environment, Unlocking the Business Case for Action, which is a collaboration between Circular Economy Leadership Canada, the CSA Group, and Globe Series. And today's event is part of our Circular Economy Solutions Series Built Environment Workstream. My name is Paul Shorthouse. I'm the Managing Director of CELC, and I'll be your host for today's virtual event. Before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm fortunate to be participating today from the unceded territory of the Coast Salish and Lekwungen-speaking peoples here in Victoria, British Columbia. I'd also like to acknowledge that attendees are joining us from the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast for this event, as well as a number of international participants. So a very warm welcome to all of you on the line. We had nearly 400 people register for this event with lots of interest right across industry and governments, nonprofits, academics, investors. I'd like to invite you to warm up your fingers a bit here and start by sharing your names and organizations in our chat box if you can. In 2021, we launched the Circular Built Environment Workstream, where we've so far undertaken research. We've launched specific projects looking at aspects of the circular economy practices right across the value chain and hosted several events and virtual workshops. We're very delighted today to partner with CSA Group to co-host this two-part event series that's designed to build off our work to date and to help better understand the business case for advancing circular economy strategies within Canada's built environment sector. Key objectives for our event series include exploring the key barriers and opportunities for advancing the business case, identifying ways to harmonize approaches across Canada to align and scale efforts, and testing the interest among stakeholders for developing a circular economy roadmap or action plan for Canada's built environment sector. Today's webinar is more focused on information sharing. Part 2 of our event series, taking place on April 27th, will be more an interactive virtual workshop where we'll be sharing more details with you all later today about that one. So stay tuned. Before we begin, I'd like to know a little bit more about our audience and would ask you just to complete these two quick polls in terms of what province or region are you joining us from today? And secondly, what aspects of the built environment value chain or aspect of the built environment value chain are you part of? And please try and choose the best fit there. You might have to scroll down to see the questions. I'll share those results with everybody in just a moment. In the meantime, while we're waiting for those results, I'll walk through our agenda for today's session. We're very excited to have Bill McDonough joining us today as a keynote speaker. Bill's a world-renowned architect and the person behind the cradle-to-cradle concept, which you'll hear more about later. We'll then hear from a panel of leaders from both private and public sectors on the current realities and barriers for moving towards a more circular economy for the built environment here in Canada, as well as some of the key priorities that we need to focus on to really make that business case for action. I encourage you to use the comments box, add links, share your questions throughout the event. But just make sure when you're doing so to send the questions to all panelists and attendees so that everybody will be able to see your questions, and we can try and share some of these back with the panel as part of the Q&A portion later on. Oh, if we can just quickly bring back the results from our poll, share those with the audience. So a nice diversity from across Canada and nice diversity as well across the value chain. So great to have everybody here. Thanks again for joining. I'd now like to just set the stage for today's webinar by sharing a bit of background context based on insights that CELC has gleaned over the last year and a half or so as part of our Circular Built Environment Workstream. Canada's built environment sector is currently the largest consumer of materials and energy in our economy, and really the greatest impact associated with the construction sector is the ongoing need for virgin resource extraction. The sector is also extremely wasteful at the moment. Up to about 40% of urban solid waste is coming from the construction and demolition side of things. So not only do we extract a lot, but we're also discarding a lot and losing a lot of that value. In Canada, about 3.4 million tons of construction materials are sent to landfill every year, and that represents about 1.8 million tons of embodied carbon in those materials. So when you're thinking about circularity in the built environment and how to maximize and recapture the value of materials and resources, it's really important to consider the three key principles of circular economy and how they apply. Number one being designing out waste from our products and assets. Number two being extending the life of our products and assets while minimizing losses. And number three, regenerating nature. And the circular economy provides a framework and business strategies for moving away from our current linear economy, allowing the full value of those materials and resources to be captured during their use and also at end of life. And we need to think about it sort of applied across the construction sector beyond waste management and diversion, and really think about the opportunities across that value chain and the life cycle of buildings and infrastructure assets, starting with circular design through to product manufacturing, asset use and operations, and that includes repair and flexible use. And lastly, sort of deconstruction and resource recovery. So moving away from our current linear supply chain, the activities that we focus on, really have to look at addressing the key challenges and barriers to making that business case for action. To really drive more circularity in our built environment, we need to develop an efficient and effective market for our products and supply chains. But the question is, how do we shift those markets? We really have to be thinking about both how we increase and drive the demand while ensuring the supply side factors are competitive with things like virgin materials in terms of cost and quality and availability. We need to be thinking in terms of how to counter the fast fashion mentality, of building fast and cheap. We need to be thinking about how to demonstrate the business case for circularity with proof points and data, including support for the financial and economic models that consider areas like whole life cycle accounting or account for externalities and consider triple bottom line benefits. And land use planning is also critical. So how do materials flow through the system? And what's the proximity of these materials to their end markets, for example, and how far they travel? In terms of better definitions and standards and information, how do we define circular products and materials and ensure the recovered materials are sent to their best and highest use or highest value? We need to improve our awareness of the opportunities and our general understanding of the terms while we develop standards around circular practices, and we'll hear a bit more about that from CSA Group. We also need to better data and information around material flows and other factors. And we know that work is underway in Canada, for example, to develop environmental product declarations and life cycle assessment data, as well as case studies that help to bring metrics to support investments in the sector. In terms of circular products and materials and buildings and infrastructure, we need to embrace the importance of circular design practices like design for disassembly and durability and adaptability, and concepts like lean manufacturing. And we also have to consider both the real and perceived risks of using recycled and secondary materials in our projects. We need to also address the lack of materials management infrastructure, such as warehouses for storing and sorting construction demolition waste streams, as well as reverse logistics to support activities like deconstruction and the recovery of secondary materials. And all of this will require collaboration and sometimes with unusual partners across the value chain to get the systems change we're looking for. We'll need to really leverage new collaborative platforms and tools or technology and processes like integrated design processes or integrated project delivery or technologies like BIM. And lastly, from a policy perspective, we need to consider economic instruments like taxation or non-financial incentives and regulation to harmonize policies across Canada where possible for things like extended producer responsibility or municipal bylaws or provincial and municipal standards, both within regions or between regions and within provinces to provide sort of a greater scale of investment opportunity. And we need to use that power of procurement as a driver for more circular practices, products, and business models, allowing innovation in tenders that focus on outcome-based specifications. So those are all some considerations coming into this in terms of the making that business case for the transition. And just one additional set of questions here for the group. In terms of what you see today as the top barriers for advancing circularity within the built environment. And secondly, what do you see as the top benefits that can support the business case for circularity in Canada and the built environment sector? So just give you a couple minutes there to complete those. And in the meantime, I'm going to introduce our colleague at the CSA group. I'd like to introduce Dwayne Torrey, who'll provide a few opening remarks from the perspectives of a leading standards developer in Canada and introduce our keynote speaker. Dwayne is the Director of Construction and Infrastructure Standards at the CSA group, and he's responsible for developing the strategic path for Canada's built environment standards through continuous assessment of emerging construction trends and critical issues, including oversight on more than 250 different codes and standards. So Dwayne, I'll pass it over to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul. My warmest welcome to each and every one of you today. It's my pleasure to represent CSA Group in co-hosting this important event with Circular Economy Leadership Canada and with the support of Globe. First of all, I'd like to thank Paul Shorthouse for his collaboration with CSA on several work streams of the circular economy that started off with plastics and now is extended to construction, infrastructure, and more broadly to Canada's built environment. I'd also like to thank all of the speakers, starting with our keynote speaker, Mr. William McDonough, and all of the stakeholders represented here today. We greatly appreciate you dedicating your time and resources to tackle this complex yet vital topic for the future of our economy. I want to take a few minutes just to provide you with an overview of who CSA Group is, why we're excited to be in this space, and what role we can play to help advance circular built environment in Canada. As a not-for-profit standards development organization, we've been working to fulfill our role as neutral facilitator, advancing standards in the public and private sectors for more than 100 years. The other separate for-profit and commercial part of the organization provides testing, inspection, and certification services. Many of you will be familiar with the CSA mark on hockey helmets, work boots, and on products around your home or your workplace. At our core, though, we're focused on enhancing the lives of Canadians through the advancement of standards. Our impact and involvement goes beyond Canada, though. CSA Group is accredited both in Canada and the US to lead the development of standards using a robust, open, transparent, and consensus-based process. At an international level, we help represent the voice of Canadians at ISO and IEC through Standards Council of Canada. And this international voice is important, given that the circular economy is indeed a topic of global relevance. CSA has taken a leading role on behalf of the Government of Ontario to manage the Canadian Mirror Committee that serves the ISO Technical Committee on Circular Economy, where one of the focus areas is construction and infrastructure. It's through our dedicated members that we're providing Canadian expertise into several international standards over the next year, working to ensure that they're going to be applicable in Canada. As such, we're both excited and well-positioned to help advance the circular built environment, both in Canada and internationally through standards. Now, I'd like to share a few words about how we operate and how we can support the circular economy. It all begins with standards development. Acting as a neutral facilitator and using our accredited approach, we work to help establish clear, consistent, repeatable solutions that are suitable for many scenarios. Research is a critical tool to help explore both the potential for new standard solutions and provide evidence to inform and accelerate standards development. Advocacy will be critical in driving public awareness of standards while promoting their value and use. And education can be leveraged to increase user knowledge of standards. At CSA Group, our 3,000 standards are developed by over 10,000 members dedicated to improving safety, health, the environment, and economic efficiency in Canada and beyond. In addition to construction infrastructure, we develop standards in 11 other focus areas, including environment, climate change, natural resources, safety and health, and electrical sectors. And it's going to be crucial to involve these when developing systems-based approaches. In construction and infrastructure alone, we manage more than 250 standards and codes through over 80 active technical committees. These nationally important standards provide a solid foundation that can directly support a circular built environment. First, we've placed emphasis on standardization solutions towards tackling climate change and are supporting government at all levels to move towards net zero carbon economy by 2050. Second, we've developed key standards and guidelines that directly support circular construction, such as deconstruction of buildings, design for disassembly and adaptability, and durability in buildings. And finally, several of our standards include provisions that support low carbon intensity solutions, where the outputs of one industry are used as inputs to another industry. These are extremely relevant examples to showcase as we move towards circular business models. The circular economy requires a systems thinking where it will be crucial to connect different paths of the economy in this whole ecosystem. And we believe we've laid the groundwork and we're ready to help roll it out from here. We're here to understand the path forward, and there is no better way to gaining more insights than to hear from our next speaker, Mr. William McDonough. William McDonough is a globally recognized leader in sustainable design and development. He co-authored Cradle to Cradle, Remaking the Way We Make Things, widely recognized as a seminal text of both the sustainability and the circular economy design movements. Bill is an architect with William McDonough and Partners, a firm known for having designed many notable landmark buildings of the sustainable architecture movement, including YouTube's headquarters in Silicon Valley, California, and Nike's European headquarters in the Netherlands. He also advises leaders on ESG, sustainability, circular economy, and the design of products and facilities through McDonough Innovation. Through Bill's third firm, MBDC, he created the Cradle to Cradle Certified Products Program and co-founded the Cradle to Cradle Products Innovation Institute, which administers the science-based, multi-attributed product standard that is recognized by the world's leading retailers, including Amazon and Walmart. Time magazine recognized Mr. McDonough as a hero for the planet, and in 2019, Fortune named him number 24 of the world's 50 greatest leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. William McDonough.
Hello, everyone. Well, I hope you can all hear me clearly. I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I live, in my office. And I'm really excited to talk to you today. And I'm going to be looking at some of the theory and the practice. So start with Plato, and then we'll end up with Aristotle. But if we look at just how this evolved for me as a person and a professional, I'd like to give you a little insight on that. So we'll start the slideshow, and I want to focus on really designing for sustainability. But I want to remember, I won the Presidential Award for Sustainable Development here in the US in the mid-90s after the Earth Summit. And my mother was there. And she said, "What have you been doing? What is this? I thought you were an architect." And then the press came up and said, "Mr. Sustainable, what does it all mean?" And I said, "I'm not that interested in sustainability, really. Because if I asked you what your relationship is to your spouse, and you said sustainable, I'd say, I'm sorry, it doesn't sound that exciting." So really, this is an exciting thing to be working with. And it's an active thing. So that's what I'm talking about. Now, as a designer, it's clear to me that design is the first signal of human intention. So we have our minds, we aim for things, and we move this way. This is design. And if we see the planet being destroyed, we have to ask, is this our plan? And if the answer is it's not our plan, then who has the plan? What is the plan? Because it's our de facto plan. It's a thing that's happening because we have no other plan. So today I'd like to talk about the concepts of cradle to cradle, the circular economy, and then bring you a new one, the circular carbon economy, as part of the plan. Now, as I mentioned, Plato would look at the values. What do we believe in? What is meaningful? What is beautiful? What is moral? What is ethical, etc. And then we can go from there through principles and visions and goals and strategies and tactics and metrics to produce value, which is part of what we're going to talk about today, in terms of making this practical and making it cost effective. Well, that's Aristotle, his student. So when we look at Plato, he was dealing with values. When we look at Aristotle, science, mathematics, action. How do you act if you have these beliefs? So that's what we're looking at here. And what we found is that if you start with your values, the quality of life, for example, then you can move through principles, vision, goals, strategies, tactics, metrics to value creation. But if you only start with the numbers, with value, money, for example, you can get to metrics, strategies, tactics, and then your goals. But you're always benchmarking because you're starting in the numbers. So I'll be 20% less bad or like that. So the real issue here is to talk about our values first. What do we believe in? How do we treat each other? So when I was 18 and went to college, I finally got to ask a question I've always wanted to ask to the physics professor. What happened? How did Hiroshima disappear? Because I grew up in Japan and Hong Kong, in Montreal, by the way. And I couldn't understand, how did Hiroshima disappear? Because I had seen it. And the other question I had is, why are we all trying to kill each other? Well, I took international relations and it was all about mutually assured destruction. So that was kind of not a career path for me. But on the physics question, he gave me the special theory of relativity and said, here, solve this equation, which was E equals mc squared. And I put it on index cards in my dorm, and I looked at it all the time, and I couldn't do it, of course. But all of a sudden one day I saw the fire burning in a fireplace, and I thought, well, that's entropy. Everything disappearing, second law of thermodynamics, not to return. But then I thought, what's negative entropy? What is order out of chaos? I'm from Asia. What's the opposite? And then I realized it was a log. Then I realized it was the tree. The tree was the aggregation of these dispersed elements, minerals, water, carbon. And so life itself was negative entropy. It was order out of chaos. So then I realized, if the sun is shining on the planet and we look like a dead rock, some water on it, then E joins with M. And we realize that equals mc squared means you have an atom bomb, because M, if it's one hydrogen atom, makes the E equal to the speed of light squared, which is immense. There's the atom, there's the bomb. But we aren't looking at biology, which is the negative entropy. So all of a sudden I realized that physics comes together with chemistry and creates life. And we get humus. And all of a sudden we have humans. A lot of people don't know, but the word human is a derivation of the word humus. So we are the soil people, and we are order out of chaos. And that is our mission. So then I thought, well, if I ever become an architect, I'm going to design buildings like trees. And my grandfather had been a lumberjack in the Pacific Northwest in the Olympics. And so, I have a lot of big tree karma to work off here. But I thought about trees, and I went, well, look at what they do. They emit oxygen, sequester carbon, fix nitrogen, accrue solar energy, create food, fuel, distill water, right? Habitats, change color with the seasons, create microclimates, even self-replicate. Well, how sophisticated are human buildings? How many buildings that fix nitrogen or emitted oxygen lately? And then how about self-replicating? Whoa. So we need design humility. So for me, design humility is remembering that it took us 5,000 years to put wheels on our luggage. And we went to the moon before we put wheels on our luggage. And it took another 20 years to put 4 wheels on our luggage. So we're still working on it. But we need to be humble in the face of nature. And why don't we use nature as our model and mentor? Because really that's a unified philosophy. So I decided to design buildings like trees. So I did a competition in Germany for a daycare center to be operated by children, moving shutters and playing with the building all day. And the engineer said, you can't do that. You can't have a building operated by children. So why not? And the teacher said, why not? We're looking for things for the kids to do all day. How about wake up the building, put it to bed at night? Things to do, watch the sun. So then also I won a competition in Poland for a skyscraper. And I said, you can have the building, but you have to plant 10 square miles of trees to offset its impacts on the climate. This is 1989, everybody. This is 33 years ago. Imagine. And we're still having these conversations. So 33 years ago. And we calculated it was about 10 square miles for the energy and active operating energy, but it was only 1/10 of the advertising budget for the building. Can you imagine that? So that was so odd, it ended up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Then in 1999, I started working with Ford Motor Company and redid the River Rouge. And we had big water quality problems. And So I said, why don't we have the world's largest green roof? And everybody said, oh, we talked to the roofing companies. It's impossible. 10.5 acres green roof. No. I was like, don't tell me it's impossible. Just tell me you can't do it. It's like, well, we talked to the roofing companies. I said, good. You talked to the polyolefin thermoplastic industry. You talked to the bitumen industry. But what about the botanists? So we found it in East Germany, then developed this camouflage for the Stasi to hide MiG fighter jets during the Cold War. Very thin, very light. And it was a sedum that could change colors with the seasons and was very, it's a succulent. But after we did the roof, and it saved Ford $35 million instead of chemical treatment plants and pipes. And on top of that, the birds started landing in about 5 days. 35 million capex, as we pointed out to the board, with the Ford Taurus at a 4% margin coming out of Chicago, is the same as walking into the board and offering them an order for $900 million worth of cars. Approved. Moving on. So these ideas are not things that we should all look at and say it's an added cost. We should look for value creation, because our values are, how do we love all the children of all species for all time? Oh, and let's go save $35 million day one. How's that? So the thinking of Cradle to Cradle is that waste equals food, use clean energy, and celebrate diversity. These are our three principles. So one thing's waste, another thing's food in nature. And clean energy is how it works, and we want to celebrate diversity, but not so much in technology as in biology. Biology loves diversity, and we want many kinds of birds and so on. Charles de Gaulle was asked what it was like to run France, and he said, what do you think it's like trying to run a country with 400 kinds of cheese? And you think about it, we want 400 kinds of cheese. I think it was 240 at the time, but we don't want 240 kinds of French plastic, because we can't really coherently deal with it. So in technology, we need coherency. So we do want to think about material passports, we call them, for products. Buildings as material banks, design for disassembly, so on. It's all in the book. And extended Proust responsibility. So Cradle to Cradle sees the world through two lenses, a biosphere and a technosphere. So we have things that go from nature back to nature. We have things of human use, which we call products as a service. And that's been picked up by a lot of people lately because it's exciting. And we call it products as a service because what you want is a service of the object, not the ownership of the molecules per se. You want a beam that holds up a building. You want a bottle that carries liquid. You don't really think you want to buy a polyethylene terephthalate. You're getting water. It's a bottle. So those things should be designed for reuse. So and even cars can be a service, as we've seen. So we know these things. So that's what we called that. So in 1995, I was asked by Steelcase, the world's largest furniture maker, to design fabrics for furniture. And I said, well, let's design a fabric that keeps you insulated and wicks away your moisture. So we used wool and ramie and warp and weft. But we also said no more persistent toxins, bioaccumulatives, endocrine disruptors, carcinogens, teratogens, birth defects, mutagens, or heavy metals. And we looked at 8,000 chemicals in the textile industry and had to eliminate 7,962. So the fabric was so clean you could eat it, and the water coming out of the factory is clean enough to drink. It is the preferred sitting fabric of the Airbus. We've probably all sat on. Now, in technical nutrition, we call it, we did Shaw Industries, which was number 5 in the carpet business, now number 1. And we were looking at these companies claiming all these environmental attributes, but they were PVC and nylon 6,6, very hard to recycle. And this is nylon 6, which can go back to chemical recycling, to caprolactam, and a thermoplastic polyolefin base, which can be thermally recycled. So basically, you're storing your raw materials on your customers' floors. And that is really a critical relationship. The relationship is worth more than the resource. But when you want a new carpet, you're going to call the company and say, I want to change, because they'll come pick this up. It is the raw material of their industry. It's perfect, designed for it, not something you have to worry about or is toxic. So I designed the factory for Herman Miller in Zeeland, Michigan. And then the first chairs that were coming out of it, they said, what do you want to do now? The factory is very successful. And it was cataloged as the best building for business in America at the time of its productivity. But all of a sudden I said, well, I want to work on the furniture. And they said, we don't have architects doing chairs. I said, well, I don't want to do chairs. Let's do all the chairs. So we started working on this concept of the cradle to cradle certifiable product, which is designed for disassembly and perceived as perpetual assets of a circular economy. Now, the recovery systems aren't in place yet, but we designed for it. So as time goes on, we know what these are. Philips was one of the early companies that we had worked with to adopt this. So we now lease these light fixtures in the Netherlands. We don't buy the fixture, we get it from Philips, and we change them out every 5 years to upgrade them, and then they get moved to someone else who could use them. So it's very exciting. So they own their raw materials, the indium and the gallium and the aluminum. These are the material of our industry. So we sell the light, not the materials. Now, the 5 characteristics of cradle to cradle are material health, circular economy, renewable energy, water stewardship, and social fairness. I call them the 5 goods. So that's what we do. And then we create a certification program that would recognize those 5 and then catalog them carefully. And so if you look at those 5 at the top, there's cradle to cradle framework for products. It's also the 5 predicates, or 5 of the predicates of all 17 sustainable development goals. You can't have any of these without those 5. So it's a really useful way of looking at things. Now, when you have an insight, like, oh, let's do a green building, or let's make an electric car, or whatever you're doing, you have an insight, and then you move to ideation, you start to dream it up. Then you start setting goals. Just imagine Elon Musk going, oh, I think we should have electric cars. Well, a lot of us can have that insight. There aren't that many people who can then go execute on it. But you start setting your goals, and then you develop strategies. And those strategies, in our case, were design safe and healthy products for all generations, for all time. Well, then it's time to implement. So we went and implemented the fabric. We worked with buildings like trees and so on. And they become standards. What's fun about that is the industry itself is creating a standard for itself, because it's not required to do it. These are just a good idea. But once they exist, then the policymakers can look at it and go, oh, I like that. If these people can do it so safely, why can't other people do it? So let's share that. Oh, and then the government gets involved and says, maybe we should make a policy. X renewable energy, X recycled content, whatever policy. And then we move to regulation and so on. So what's interesting is that I helped found the LEAD program that launched at the University of Virginia when I was the dean. And these kinds of things are really important because they form a standard that's done in the industry, and then regulators can eventually work with it when the time comes. So for the certified products, we developed this giant protocol that's chemistry all the way to the molecule. And so that's the standard. And then you work to certify against that standard, which is deep chemistry, as well as renewable energy, circular economy, clean water, and social fairness. So that was that. Now it's been picked up, wonderfully by Walmart. They've said all these cosmetics should be silver certified, cradle to cradle or above. It's nice. And then we also had Amazon announce that cradle to cradle. They called me and said, we think it's the best certification in the world. And so Jeff Bezos and I were part of announcements that Amazon have a program where you can get the best products. And so we started with cradle to cradle. Very, very nice. So when we see regulations, they're really a signal from a designer's perspective of design failure. Like, whoops, what have we done? And so if we look at a design failure in environmental legislation or in chemical toxicities and so on, these are what happened in the United States on regulations. And look at them starting in the 30s. And this is the ones around environmental regulation. But look at this, chemical pollutants. Now, think about what's going on right now with nanoplastics that are breaking the blood-brain barrier of fish in the ocean, or microplastics that we're starting to see everywhere, and even in our bodies. So when you look at that, signals of design failure. So what is important is to remember your values about quality, Circular economy is quantity. So if you take the quality of cradle to cradle and you put it together with the technosphere, biosphere, technosphere, it's fundamentally the circular economy. And we break it into these two elements. But you've got to remember that not just going from linear economy to a circular economy, which we've been talking about I've been doing it for 40 years now. But what's beautiful, it's actually a fractal because it's self-similar to every scale. These principles of cradle to cradle apply from the molecule to the planet at every scale, like a fractal. And we move from conventional linear flows to circular flows. And we can start to think about positive systems at every scale. So we've even designed sample cities here for the China Development Bank, cities that feed themselves. The paper I'm holding here in Beijing 2 decades ago was Cradle to Cradle, the Circular Economy and the Search for Eco-Civilization. And I'm shaking hands with my co-chair from China, Madam Deng Nan, Deng Xiaoping's daughter, who ran the Earth Summit for China. So as we start designing this way with the buildings, we can get inspired by these ideas. And here's the first circular economy real estate development in Amsterdam. 100% renewably powered, purifies on water, so on. And every time we do a building, we improve the number of critical certified products. So it's always constant improvement. But one of the recognitions was that carbon in the circular economy is both a material and a fuel. So I wrote an article for Nature, and this picture was accompanying the article. And everybody looks and says, oh, what is that? Beijing pollution. For those of you who are from Vancouver, you will note this is your convention center. That's a fog. So it's not a scary picture, but isn't it interesting how our eyes can fool us? Carbon is not the enemy. We've demonized it. But what we really have to do is celebrate living carbon, which is us, and soil. That's positive behavior. Let's encourage that. And then we have durable carbon, which are objects of utility that last a long time or are now sitting quietly, and that kind of thing. And so those are durable carbon, and they work across generations. And then we have a negative behavior, which is fugitive carbon. So atmospheric fugitive carbon or plastics in the ocean and so on, that is a negative behavior. And these are toxins, wrong material, wrong place, wrong dose, wrong duration. So let's think that way. So in terms of thinking that way, I got asked by the G20 2 years ago to develop something I wanted to work on, which is the circular carbon economy. And you have to realize that at this moment, the amount of dry mass in the world of human-made objects exceeds that of all living things. Think about that. So I was asked to create this, and so we did it and presented it, and the 20 world leaders endorsed it. And the idea was to go from cradle to cradle to circular economy to circular carbon economy. And the reason is, same diagram, except looking at carbon, is that we're moving all this carbon from the geosphere to the atmosphere. And we have to cut that by 50% by 2030, absolutely. We have to adopt renewable energy, absolutely. And we'll never get to the climate goals in Paris without this moving as fast as possible. We also have to remove it by encouraging natural systems, regenerative systems, and we also have to do mechanical removal, even though it surprises people, because nature is not powerful enough to handle what we have to get done. So that's an important idea. So what it brings us back to is that being less bad is not being good, it's just being bad by definition, and less so. So the question becomes, is our goal to be less bad and be less unsafe, less unhealthy, economically driven? If our goal is zero, it's actually not great for the kids. They get upset because you tell them, I'm trying to be zero and you have to feed and clothe you. Sad. No. And if you just say, I'm going to reduce my emissions by X, you're telling us what you're not going to do, which is like telling a taxi driver, quick, I'm not going to the airport. It's information, but it's not that useful. So our goals are to be more good, delightfully diverse, safe, healthy, and just. Clean air, soil, water, and power, economically, equitably, ecologically, and elegantly enjoyed. So we take what we don't want and put it below the line. We take what we do want and put it above the line. So our target is actually 100% fabulous, not simply net zero bads, but 100% positive goods in a regenerative and circular economy. And we get rid of the net negatives, which are degenerative and linear. So we start by an inventory, and we move through assessment, value, and then we develop our working plan. So the fundamental shift, the circular economy for me, is we move from the idea of natural sources. People call them natural resources. That bothers me. Nature doesn't have resources. Nature has sources. Humans have resources because we're talking about human utility. So our job is to take nature's beautiful sources and turn them into resources, and then again into resources. Welcome to the circular economy. Nature doesn't have a design problem. People do. Thank you.
I love it. Wonderful, Bill. Thank you so much. Waste is food. Live off clean energy and embrace diversity. Love the principles of cradle to cradle. Thank you so much for sharing those insights and inspirations.
I hope it was helpful.
Great setup for our next discussion. So thank you and wish you all the best, Bill. Hope you can stay connected with us on this topic as Canada embarks on its circular economy journey.
Happy to help.
Thanks very much. I'd now like to shift gears to hear from our panel in response to Bill's vision and design principles and the art of what's possible. Just before I do that, though, I'd like to ask Victoria to bring back the results from our second poll. And you can see there we had policy and supply chain issues being some of the biggest barriers, while reducing environmental footprint and cost reduction as some of the greatest benefits identified from the group here. Thanks very much for sharing your thoughts on that. So to kick off our panel, I'd now like to introduce Vince Catelli. Vince is someone who's been focused on circular economy in the built environment space now for 2.5 decades, where his work as an architect has explored the topics of deconstruction and design for disassembly and adaptability. He's worked to integrate these practices into a number of buildings or clients that include Mountain Equipment, Canadian Tire, the Department of National Defense, just to name a few. So Vince, we'll give you an extra few minutes on the panel here, and over to you to introduce your colleagues.
All right, thanks, Paul. Welcome, everybody. We have a wonderful panel discussion planned here for us today. And I'd like to first kick it off by actually introducing our panel. The full bios are on the website for those of you who wish to go into in greater detail with some of the profiles. But our first panel member is Jonathan Westeindy. He is the founder and the CEO of Windmill Development Group, an innovative eco-social real estate firm, and Windmill led the first LEED Platinum community in Canada through Dockside Green in Victoria, and also another first One Planet Living community in Canada, the Zibi development here in Ottawa. He understands, and under his leadership, the team has been directly engaged in over $5 billion in high-performing, socially responsible real estate outcomes. Our second panel member is Mary Van Buren, who is the president of the Canadian Construction Association. She is a proven leader in promoting the value of the construction profession. Talk about value, you know, we heard about it just moments ago. The construction profession, and advocating for the adoption of technology and standards to improve the professionalism. She excels in developing and empowering people to generate positive outcomes, especially within her membership and the construction industry as a whole. Our third panel member is Nick Zenos, who is the executive director of the Centre for Greening Government within the Treasury Board Secretariat of the Government of Canada. And that center is working diligently with all federal departments and agencies towards zero carbon, sustainable, and climate resilient government operation. And last but not least, Matt Keller, who is a general manager at the City of Toronto Solid Waste Management Services Division. Obviously, Toronto being Canada's largest city, a very large responsibility on his part to manage. And they manage almost 1 million tons of waste per year through one of the most comprehensive integrated waste management systems in North America. His division is leading the city's overall circular economy program. They actually have the probably the first dedicated circular economy team in North America at a city level. So I'd like to welcome our panel members who represent a diversity of the ecosystem within the construction sector. And just having listened to Bill's remarks and his keynote, it's wonderful to see. He's kind of allowed us. He's painted a picture for the circular economy, the circular built environment. And what I'd like to do is, if I could ask the panel members to address, what are they seeing in this future vision, and what is resonating with them about this future and the optimism that comes with it. So I'd like to start, if we could, with Jonathan to reflect on that. So I'll ask you to unmute you. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And yeah, fantastic presentation, obviously thought-provoking and always great. Bill's been an inspiration to our path and our company strategy for over a few decades now as well. So I think the, a couple of things that come out of that are quite intriguing. One is the, again, the focus on not just reduce, but to regenerate. And that's really the aspirations and goals we need to be seeking, and more so. And this is what we really focus on. I mean, we're sort of working through what we call a one planet living system, which, if you look at that from an ecological footprinting standpoint, if everyone lived the way we do in North America, we'd need 5 planets. So we're trying to create opportunities, developments that sort of see how you can live within the resources of one planet, which is very much about leveraging the circular economy and doing so. But it really comes down to not just looking at, what's a comparable cost to cost, but what is the value creation opportunities. And one example I'll speak to just quickly that is sort of hitting at home is on Dockside Green, which was the first LEED Platinum community in Canada. We implemented a on-site wastewater treatment plant, which in itself was hard to understand the economics, how that could work. We were working with a municipality that didn't have a waste treatment plant, and from all accounts, just on a line-by-line comparative, didn't make any sense. But as we implemented and looking for the value creation, what it resulted in is natural wetlands, waterfront properties that wouldn't have been waterfront by virtue of having to put these streams through the community, that sort of thing. And just the appreciation created by those natural assets more than paid for the system itself. And that's not something that would have been looked at in the straight sort of, okay, what's this waste system more like compared to that waste system? And so it's really, we are creating value. The more you can get back to sort of natural, circular, healthy, these are all values that are just hard to figure out how you put a tangible component to that, but they're there, and that's the challenge. So
excellent. Mary, I wonder if as in the construction sector, what are you seeing that resonates in this future?
Yeah, well, Bill certainly packed a lot of inspiration in 20 minutes or so. So my mind's a little reeling right now. I think one of the most exciting opportunities is that governments, not just in Canada, but elsewhere, are investing billions and trillions of dollars in infrastructure. So it's a once in a generational opportunity to build back greener. And certainly the construction sector can be that path to green. We have visionary leaders, and we've got some of them on the call today, and the talented men and women who are ready and willing to do that. So it's also a great time to attract our workforce of the future, because people want to have that connection to something bigger than themselves. And again, what an exciting time to be in the industry and to make those generational impacts. So overall, I think it's it's incredible timing. And I think another piece he's really alluded to was the ecosystem, and Vince, you used those words as well. And that's such a big opportunity for us to work better together. And by us, I mean our own ecosystem of owners and designers and builders and those who maintain the facilities, so that we're working much more collaboratively, so that construction contractors are earlier in the process. So I just see tons of upside, and again, what a great time to be in the industry and to be making these important advancements to net zero.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Nick, I'm wondering, you have a lot of big shoes to fill in terms of as Canada's largest owner and procurer of goods and services and so on. What are you seeing that kind of excites you and is resonating about this future?
Yeah, I think what's, I mean, again, the presentation was great and inspiring, and I agree with my panel members. And so what's interesting is I think what's shifted a bit over time is how we know that our procurement and our actions make a difference, right? Like, it's not kind of an anonymous decision to decide to buy one thing or another. I don't think it's I think it's it needs to be a very deliberate, explicit decision. Now, you know, the federal government or any national government tends to be the largest public procurer in a country and the largest asset owner. And so how can we use that to help promote this vision of being regenerative, right? Not just being zero carbon, but actually being positive. How do we, but every organization, and I think the awareness level of organizations that they know that their procurement can have social and economic goals. And, you know, we've redefined, as the federal government, we've redefined our procurement to be best value, right? Which very much goes in that sense. So it's not lowest cost, it should be best value. So we can define that in many different ways. The greening government strategy has a bunch of commitments to be zero carbon, et cetera, and aim for a circular economy. So I think, but it's a really deliberate decision in some of the biggest things we buy. And some of the biggest things we buy is construction materials, is building, is our infrastructure, right? A lot of our world is about buildings and how we get between buildings. A lot of that drives the environment and the economy. And we realized, a bit like the design problem, we realized, and COVID's probably made us realize it, is we have our houses that are empty half the day, traditionally pre-COVID. Our office buildings are empty the other half of the day, and then we all pile onto our infrastructure for a couple hours a day in the morning and a couple hours in the afternoon. And then we design for that. And so how do we repurpose, not to say redesign, but how do we repurpose and get the most out of this infrastructure that we can't afford to fix now to make zero carbon or zero waste or all that kind of thing? So how do we, while we have this opportunity to retrofit, renovate, repurpose this infrastructure, and think about and save the embodied carbon by not asking for a bunch of new resources, if you will, and figuring out how do we do this properly and refit this properly. I think we have a great window, and if we can get it right, then I think we're at an interesting point in our history, if you will, for climate change, for waste, and for many other things.
Yeah, very, very thoughtful. Thank you. That's you've given me a lot to think about there. Matt, you know, the city is really the doer in government, I think, to use your words, and it's nice to see how you guys are, in fact, leading the charge in a very unique way by having a dedicated team. Obviously, the city of Toronto sees something in this future, and so I'm curious to hear, as the doer level of government and at the community level, what is resonating with you? What is exciting you about this opportunity for the community?
Well, for me, it's just changing the mindset from a building, rather than having, you know, the resources in that building. That building is a bank, right? And if you design it in a way where those materials can be moved at end of life or end of purpose and be moved to another facility or another area, is really quite intriguing. And we need to make sure that, you know, it starts at the very beginning, from the design aspect of the buildings, of the procurement process, of the materials, so that can happen. And, you know, looking at buildings and in infrastructure, how we can disassemble pieces or reassemble them as required. So modularity is, I think, really important moving forward. But again, the piece that was really interesting was, you know, being a business and putting the materials into a building, allowing somebody to use that, and then when you need them back, you can take them back and put them into a completely different build. So that was a really great example, and something that we'll definitely be looking at in some of our construction work here in solid waste management.
Okay. And Now, of course, there's the flip side. We can speculate, we can dream, we can look ahead, and it is exciting. And I'm quite encouraged by what we can see in the future. But there's a reality of today and the challenges, and I'm wondering if maybe, let's take the flip side at this point and look at some of the challenges and barriers, maybe just a couple examples. And perhaps maybe Matt, if I could start with you in this instance, what are you seeing as some barriers and challenges, something that the industry has to grapple with, and that you're speaking to the industry right now. So what do you want them to hear are the challenges that we need to grapple with?
So I think the biggest challenge is the need for the demand, right? Driving the demand. So, typically demand is through the consumer wanting that product and paying potentially in the case of most recycled and upcycled materials slightly more. Or there's the government side where policies are developed and either recycled content is mandated in materials, or there's incentives for buildings to have recycled content in them. So that's key, but it all also depends on having robust national standards that all the materials that are designed can be designed to a certain standard that fit the building code, that fit architects and engineers requirements for those buildings. And last but not least, in order to get all those materials out of the buildings, you need to have the infrastructure, generally at the municipal level or private sector, that can repurpose those materials to then be used in new or upcycled into new products. And so that gap too needs to be filled through the demand, right? So I think the more demand that there is from the private sector and from governments in building circularity into their infrastructure, the more the infrastructure to support that and the standards will come. And I think lastly, the information piece is absolutely critical as well, because no matter how much demand there is, we still need the supply of that raw material from, potentially old construction sites. So we need to track and monitor that so that when you do go out and want to build in that circularity aspect, there's the material available, right? So it's a very big challenge, but with the people on this call and on the panel, something I'm fairly confident that we could advance.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah. Speaking of demand, it really is chicken and egg, isn't it? If you think about it, what comes first? The materials or the client side both have to accelerate at the same time, hopefully. Nick, you're grappling with that direct issue in procurement as an example. Among other challenges. So again, I'm going to ask the same question to you. What are you seeing as those challenges and barriers that we need to, as an industry, have to solve basically and tackle head on?
Yeah, I kind of group it in three things: the demand, the supply, and the kind of information in between that both need. And so, we have commitments like reduce embodied carbon from construction materials by 30% starting in 2025. So then what we need to do is build the knowledge and capacity of the buyers so they know what to ask for, because I think that's not a small step. Then the suppliers need to be able to provide the supply. But I'm a bit like Matt. I think if the demand's there, the supply will fill it. Like, I actually think we have a pretty innovative economy that can adjust and change. But I think maybe what's missing is we need more information, standards, et cetera, where, we need to know what's the carbon footprint of a construction material built in this plant versus that plant in this region versus that region, all that kind of stuff, so that we can move faster to adopt what lower carbon something is, right? Or a circular economy something. I also think we need to, push hard when we operationalize this thing, pick 3 or 4 categories of things we buy, make those work, right? Drive hard in those areas, make them work, and then we can replicate it broader and faster. But we see it, we're a large organization, buy lots of stuff. So how do we develop those kind of principles across different categories of goods and services? And how do we make it easy for people? Because you're trying to convince 5,000 people or 10,000 people to do something. How can we make it easier, simpler, faster for people? Because we need to move faster than we are, obviously.
Right. Yeah. Talking about change and changing roles, Mary, I wonder, I mean, the constructor is going to be potentially reinventing themselves a little bit because, you know, they're the keepers of these materials, both at the in supplying and procuring and building them according to specification and so on. What are you seeing as, you know, as a key challenge? Because I mean, you're really stuck realizing the building, the infrastructure.
Yeah, well, I certainly echo what the polls showed earlier, which is the supply chain is probably one of the biggest barriers. And unfortunately, it's been massively disruptive with COVID and then some of the container issues that happened, you know, a couple of years ago. So we do have a double hurdle there, which is just getting our supply chain back in some sort of working order and reducing all those risks. And then secondly, moving toward the green products and certifications. Again, that is going to come with some leadership from the owner side and the design community, and certainly from Canada's own manufacturers and suppliers, and the incentives that they will can take advantage of in order to be green leaders. And I agree, I think it's been remarked on several times where that's a huge opportunity for Canada. We are exporters as a nation, and so why not be leaders in green products? So that's certainly an opportunity. But there's, again, fierce competition for these resources. And if we look at electric batteries, for example, or batteries used for electric vehicles, and we see certainly more growth there, we need to also include our Indigenous communities. A lot of these resources are on their lands. And so making sure that that they're part of the equation. And that was a message that Bill brought as well around celebrating diversity. So we need to get better at working together. And Nick talked about the federal government taking the lead in looking at procurement as value. But not all public agencies are doing that. And it's tough. You know, you get it, you're a municipality, you only have so much money. And it's harder for them to move to the life cycle approach, looking at both the cost to build and then hopefully the reduced costs over time, and certainly the opportunity for a reduced footprint. So those are certainly some of the challenges that we're seeing, but you know, encouraged to hear the discussions today.
Yeah. And Jonathan, you're in a unique position, and frankly, I've always seen you taking considerable risk compared to your peers. Now that things are changing, as we know, but where do you see the challenge and barriers? You know, when you look at your sector in particular, who are trying to realize the developments and so on, not quite owners. Sometimes maybe you might act as an owner on behalf of an owner, but where are you seeing the challenges? What's it going to take for that, your particular sector?
Well, I think I agree with everything that's been said so far. So not to repeat that, maybe I'll go on a bit of a tangent, which we've always focused on as well, which is there is a need for financial innovation and all this relative to the context. Like, we are a society of instant gratification, first cost being the cheapest, rules everything else is secondary. And you know, we learned, you know, I was on the founding board of the Canada Green Building Council, which for 10 years we just heard a LEED building is a higher first capital cost, even though you could do study after study show the life cycle benefits. And over time now, you know, your average institutional investor would not even think about, you know, buying a commercial asset unless it's because they understand now the resilience and the durability and the other things that are value oriented, and also understanding how to sort of underwrite the life cycle benefit of that. And so I think as we get into all products as it relates to looking at regenerative is how do we get the thinking past first capital cost and looking at things that are life cycle beneficial, which in most cases they are. And then that gets to disruptive business models. So when you start looking at that, meaning, okay, that's like, how do we get spaces used 24/7 as much as possible? How do we get cars utilized, in such a way that they're always on the road? And that's when we start getting into, as Bill touched on before, where we're talking about a lot of these products now come to the market as services as opposed to purchase, because you can underwrite the life cycle benefits of those sorts of things. So there's getting to kind of a universal language understanding, such as the cradle to cradle certification, where we can assess and value and understand A to B, and then understand how you can sort of look at a life cycle value versus a first capital cost issue, which it is, and what is that value, which has been touched on, and then what's the business model that can now make that easy, convenient, and give a sense of instant gratification, which is unfortunately how human nature works.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, you're as a developer, you're I kind of see you as an architect. I see you as a client, obviously, and a key decision maker, and so on. And so I'm wondering, beyond looking at the barriers and some of the things that you've just discussed, especially on the financial side and so on, which is without a doubt, I can't argue, you are definitely 100% correct. We have to think differently about things, especially on the financial side of things. What would you recommend to those of us who want to move this forward, this agenda forward? What are the 2 to 3 actions that we should be taking as within this short term or medium term duration to advance this issue?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of places to go with that, but I mean, from where I sit, I think, again, one of the more frustrating parts is just having everyone starting at least speaking the same language. So whether we're speaking about life cycle assessment, whether we're speaking about, we're looking at procurement meaning value, not cost, those are all different kind of concepts, languages, all leading to the same thing. So particularly when we're in the construction procurement area, ideally can be led by public sector, because they're great at doing those things that can ripple through to private sector procurement methodology, that sort of stuff. What is that framework that we're going to rally around? We sometimes get paralyzed by perfection. Nothing's going to be perfect, but it's really going to be more what can we get people to essentially lobby and use and start using to compare that apple to apple, and so that's what then spins out the ability to properly assess. It's like the equivalent of getting to the point, even with when you do an energy model for a building, you could have 4 different energy modelers come out with different outcomes, depending on how they interpret. But at least there's a tool people are using, and you can and then that kind of universal tool is sort of missing in many cases here, and would love to get that going in place. And then I think, where we are spending more of our time, because we can have direct impact, is just that idea of that circular lifestyle. Not everybody needs to have, their tools. You can have a tool room, everyone can share, car sharing, all these sorts of things. These are things that are, again, stuff that are part of the circular economy, are all driven to that carbon equation, all those sorts of things. But I think you can easily create that, value creation. So that's the end of occupancy, and at the beginning point is just that universal tool to assess, and then be able to communicate and create the model around that.
Okay, interesting. And that's very interesting. And Mary, as a constructor and representing constructors, there's a daunting task ahead here, but what are the the actions that you would like to see, or you're hearing from industry, your sector, in order to mobilize the circular economy? What are some of the things that you highly recommend and would like to put forward? This is your opportunity, Mary.
I think the good news is, again, we're moving from more conversation to action. And the more people that are engaged, the more people are seeing the opportunities and are making steps forward. We put together a white paper last year on resiliency and our recommendations, and really 2 of them emerged. The first is that we do need a long-term infrastructure plan. And Bill mentioned that as well. We need to be mindful about what we're doing, and we need to be thoughtful about it, because it does consume a lot of resources and a lot of dollars. So let's think about it before we just, go off and start building things. And I'm not saying that's easy to do, because there are a lot of different priorities we need to balance. But certainly having a long-term plan would allow us all to get lined up, get the manufacturer suppliers lined up, get the supply chain, get all of the certifications, get the taxonomy sorted out. So that would be certainly a really big benefit. And then the second, again, echo what's been said around having those positive policies, having those standards in place. And we certainly support the work that the CSA has been doing to help us speak the same language and all be confident in what we're doing, so that if a builder uses a material that they believe to be as green or meets the standards, that it does in fact meet the standards, because they don't want to take on a disproportionate amount of the risk. Happy to share the risk, but not to take on all the risk of the new products and innovations that will occur. So again, having an incentive to do that would also be beneficial. So really those are the two big things, is have that long-term vision for infrastructure, and then getting our policies and standards in place.
Yeah, it's interesting how I'm hearing, consistently between you and Jonathan, is the idea of, what are we talking about, and let's clearly define it a bit more, and the taxonomy as you expressed it, and so on. And then there was a second point that you made, and what was the second point? Please remind me.
Long-term planning.
The plan, yes. This is very important, because I've done some national consultation, and that is that national strategy, so that we're kind of all rowing in the same direction. And how could I have forgotten that? That's a very important element. And so I'm really reassured to hear both of you, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to hear more of these other messages I also heard. And so, Nick, I'm wondering, what are the actions that you're seeing? Because you're now on the other side of the fence, if you will, and I hate to put up a fence, but nonetheless, on the client side. So what are the three, actions, 2 to 3 key actions that you see that need to happen in order to be a bit more responsive here to what we're hearing?
Maybe on the other side of the forest or something. We'll use a natural thing, not fences. We'll bring, I would say, I would say prioritize a few categories or a few areas, whether that's certain construction materials or a whole building approach or something. Prioritize a few areas, pick the greenest or most innovative at scale, large though. So like we're trying to work with other large green public buyers so that you can create a demand. And then basically you got to answer kind of 2 questions, which I always find are the 2 questions that I always get. How much does it cost? And does the technology exist, right? And so in the cost, the answer is think of it over a life cycle, think of it over a broader best value type of scenario than we used to. And then the technology, often the technology or the supply will exist. We just need to educate the buyers. So in my mind, pick the biggest, greenest buyers, pilot, demonstrate a few areas in a few specific categories. But what often happens is people aren't all at the table. Like you don't often have the suppliers with the buyers and the standards type information, technical people at the same table. People often will do this independently. And so they then have to, even if the supplier makes the supply available, they then have to re-educate the buyer to convince them that it's okay. And then they have to re-educate the standard setters or the, codes people to say, it's like, why don't we try bringing the 3 together at the same time, accelerate that, and then make it happen, because we do need to move faster.
Yeah, and interesting. So I'm hearing, kind of a systems level way of thinking here, and an integrated way of thinking, and also picking some targets. And I know you guys, not to put it out, well, I'll put it out there because it's public information, and that is the structural systems that you guys are looking at and addressing with a target for 2025. So that includes, obviously the key structural components of concrete, steel, and wood, and so on. So I'm glad you're actually practicing what you're preaching today, which is focusing, and thank you for focusing on structural systems. Yeah. Now, Matt, I'd like to kind of ask you the same question. And I know that you guys at the city have done some very deep diving into this issue with consultant reports and all kinds of other things. What are you seeing as at the community level as your 2 to 3 key actions and things that we in the industry here that we're talking to could be assisting with?
I think a more robust and comprehensive data and information on material management. Knowing what buildings are potentially coming down, the volume of materials, how does that feed into potential new feedstock on not just a municipal level or a provincial level, but a national level, and just being able to gauge how many tons of resources are available from a demolition or a reconstruction, I think is really key, because then that helps build the demand, and you can model that out and frame it, knowing year by year on estimate, what buildings would likely come down and the resources from that. A couple other pieces were touched on already with like national standards and the universal tool. But one of the pieces that I think gets built into the cost benefit analysis is, the cost of demolition of the current building to build your new one, but not the demolition or retrofit or reuse of the building you're going to build, right? So having a full life cycle wrapped into that cost benefit analysis and making sure that the triple bottom line aspects are taken into consideration for best value, but knowing that someone, whether you will own that building and redevelop it or someone else, will have to pay to put that building potentially and most likely in the ground somewhere in a landfill, and the environmental costs of maintaining landfills for 50 to 100 years after they're closed well exceed the potential cost of, a couple numbers on a spreadsheet for the demolition, right? So bringing that in. But I think too, we need to look at what provincial and federal governments fund. And so when we're looking at what governments fund, it's typically new, nice, shiny roads or buildings that you can cut ribbons on. They very rarely fund, big retrofit or the maintenance of existing infrastructure, right? It's not out there front and center. So the more we invest in maintaining the buildings, the less buildings we need to demolish to build new ones, or roads or other built infrastructure. So, and maybe that has to do with, adjusting how we issue debt within the provincial or the federal financing structure to support more, rehabilitation, retrofit, and maintenance, but also too on the private side, potentially there's adjustments on the tax code that could be done to incentivize perhaps faster writing off of green builds versus regular builds, or vice versa, whatever works well for the business to make their business case. So that's just a few things from my end.
Okay, very good. Paul, I think you've been monitoring the chat, and I'm just wondering if there are any pressing questions that we can put forward to the panel at this point.
Yeah, that's been a very active chat. Lots of good discussion, lots of questions here. I've been compiling a few to bring to the group, and given the number of questions that have come in, maybe we'll put a few forward, and one or two people can respond to a question kind of with snappy first thoughts, and then we can get through a few more questions on the list if we can. So the first question I'm going to put to the group is, there's a general sense from some that building codes are a bit too prescriptive. We know that, there's a model code, and then the provinces manage sort of the building code updates, et cetera, with input from industry and others. The question is, how can we make building codes more flexible to enable more use of secondary materials, wood, metal, while still ensuring sort of safety, efficiency, etc. Anybody have thoughts around the role of the building code and its ability to enable kind of circular economy materials and practices?
I'll maybe jump in on with a comment, which is true of circular economy and other things, is that right now we kind of move our building code sort of from one prescriptive level to lots of consulting, lots of time go by, lots of things become out of date, whatever, until there's one next wide sweeping change. And, we're moving into a need to be a bit more dynamic, a bit more flexible. And there really isn't the concept of piloting. you know, and trying things out and getting controlled failures, you know, to sort of know what to put in place until we get to perfection. And so it is with some of these things, it doesn't directly apply, but it is how can we get, you know, sort of an ability to sort of not necessarily make building codes completely more flexible because they're hard enough, but allow for piloting and effective some R&D within the cycles of codes to evolve things faster.
Yeah. Just speaking from experience, Paul, part 2 of the building code does allow for equivalencies, but it's not easy. So how do we make it easy? I have actually used part 2 for product equivalencies on the Mountain Equipment Co-op projects, both in Winnipeg and Ottawa. But again, it wasn't easy. And to reinforce prescriptive versus performance, you know, performance is really where, and the energy codes are seeming to move in that direction anyways. And I suspect more will be moving in that direction in other regards of the building code as well. Is there any?
Yeah, well, why don't we jump to another question then? So a question about how circular economy still sort of sits in the area of reuse and recycling and less around sort of addressing reduction of material use. I'm just wondering if the group here has any thoughts around how the development and construction sectors can sort of address the kind of opportunities around circular economy and the upstream kind of reduction side while continuing, you know, to build and grow in that sense.
I can maybe chime in. I think the reduce is going to be an important part of this. You know, I think we have a window where we're going to need to renovate, retrofit, repurpose a whole bunch of infrastructure, and I think at the same time, as we do that, we need to think how to best fully use it. You know, and so in our strategy federally, if there's buildings we don't need or we can repurpose. You know, if on one end you need a bunch of new space, on another end you need to retrofit a bunch of stuff. So can those come together so that you can fully utilize the resources? Because of course, the standard thing on buildings that we all know is nobody can afford to maintain all the buildings they have and the infrastructure they have, right? So how do we use this opportunity to redirect that so we get on a sustainable path and from an environmental point of view, a regenerative path as well, right?
Great. And if we think back to Bill's points too around design is such an important part, if we're thinking about design for disassembly and adaptive reuse, et cetera, then those materials can likely go back into new projects at the end of their use at time of renovation, et cetera. So lessening the demand for virgin materials, for example.
Yeah, and we have to think innovatively, Paul. I mean, you know, with one project, we engaged the Boy Scouts, believe it or not, to clean the brick at $1 a brick. And so, if we think a little bit more creatively, I think we can actually do a lot more, and safely too. By the way, you don't do that unsafely.
Right. I mentioned this earlier in my opening in terms of driving towards often the lowest cost in bidding, et cetera. I wonder if the group here has a thought around this question, which is how do we get everyone thinking about costs over the life cycle of assets or buildings versus the current sort of limited upfront purchase price? Any thoughts around shifting kind of the...
Mary, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, just again, it's so challenging when, at least on the public owner side, where they're held to an election cycle. And so, you know, you're kind of 3 years and then you're looking at the next stage. And so that works, I think, against what we're trying to do as a nation. And so this is why, again, we say we've got to look longer term. We have to look at the asset, not just what it costs us today to build, but what are the benefits over the long term, and to build that in sooner. And certainly the early contractor involvement would help to come up with new solutions and innovative approaches. So yeah, it's really tough on the public side if they're stuck to a 3-year cycle.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, any thoughts, I wonder? Oh, Nick, you have some thoughts?
Well, I can add you know, in contrast to that cycle is the fact that public governments will own that building for a long time. Whereas in the private sector, they might turn it over very quickly, right? And And, you know, we look at prisons or bases or science labs, like we're going to hold on to them 40, 50 years, or parliament, you know, 100 plus years, right? And so in the greening government strategy, we put in using a $300 shadow price of carbon, $300 per ton every time we retrofit a major building. So, and over a 40-year cycle. So like at Treasury Board, we're kind of looking at the accounting, if you will, looking at the life cycle. What are the tools and what are the ways we can impose the analysis on a longer time frame, which makes then the environmental sense, right? So how do you combat that initial kind of sense of, oh, but it's going to be 10% more expensive up front, which is always the sticker price that people never look at, yeah, but on 40 years, you know, which is a lot harder to analyze as well, right? So.
No, and I think that's the, you know, there's a lot of comments I've seen in there just about, you know, long-term ownership versus short-term ownership, and one in sense the other. And I disagree in the context that it is the job of how you translate that life cycle benefit in finance, as I say, you know, come up with finance tools, other things, so that it can be the same. And, you know, I know, for example, with condominiums in Canada, we were the first that came up with the concept of a green loan. So I won't get into too many technical, but it was with the idea of, okay, how can I amortize those higher capital costs and still position it as value, even though I'm selling it, and have that owner benefit from that value and still do it all at the same cost today that I'm transacting at. And that's sort of that higher complexity, as Nick touched on, right? And that's the job of, you know, for this to evolve of all of us as an industry, is how you go back to both determining what's that value, how you can communicate that value, and that's a lot harder than just saying I'm building X and it's costing Y. Thank you very much.
Yeah, interesting.
The other challenge with that too is, you know, if you've got a finite amount of financial resources to do work, if you build 9 sustainable, perhaps better, longer term value buildings, you could have gotten maybe 10 regular buildings, right? And again, back to where do those get placed? And some of the politics around those buildings drive some of the investment decisions too, right? So again, it's you can get more infrastructure with a little less upfront money, back to you know, to the tax base who's really funding that.
That's great. I'm conscious of time. I'd like to help people wrap up and get on with the rest of their day as well. So maybe I'll put some additional questions forward to the group afterwards, and we might be able to build that into the summary report as some of the responses going forward. So just like to thank Vince and the whole panel here for your excellent insights and for sharing, you know, what we need to do to move towards more of Bill's vision and design principles for our built environment. Thank you very much for your time and your effort. And I will invite Dwayne, if he's still around, to join me back on screen, and we'll just do a quick wrap up here for everyone to say thanks again. On behalf of CALC, CSA Group, Globe Series, I'd like to say a big thanks again to the speakers, but also to all the participants for coming out today, engaging in the chat, you know, doing the polls, sharing your information. We really managed to capture some useful insights and information that will help to set us up for the deeper dive conversations at part of next week's virtual workshop. So everybody here, welcome to join us for part 2 of this event series. On April 27th, we have a 90-minute virtual workshop focused on unlocking the business case for action. It'll be an opportunity to sort of roll up your sleeves and engage in interactive breakout group discussions to help set the course for action and really explore the opportunity or potential for developing an action plan or roadmap in this space for Canada's built environment and construction sector. Invite you to reach out to myself or Dwayne here. Our contact emails are there, and we welcome new partners, new collaborators as part of this work stream. So welcome you to get in touch. We also, CELC, have a monthly newsletter, and you can sign up for that on our website. It includes upcoming events, research, reports on all things circular economy happening across Canada. We also have a job posting section, etc. Lots of collaboration opportunities. Dwayne, any last words?
On behalf of the CSA Group, thank you so much to everybody. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Mr. McDonough, and fantastic questions coming forward. So definitely lots of food for thought for us, but thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. That concludes our webinar today. Thanks very much for your time and hope you enjoyed the event. Take care.